Hello, and welcome to another video from Ritual Woodcraft. Today I've been commissioned to build a tabletop out of old timber from a deconstruction in Los Angeles. These timbers are well over 100 years old and were joists in a building and have the nail holes and some nails still in them from where the floorboards were secured to these joists. Now, I don't have a jointer big enough to join the faces where these boards are going to glue together. So I'm using my Makita track saw. Carefully set up, you can cut a very straight 90-degree angle right down the side of a long plank. And these tracks, two of them together, are 110 inches. These boards are just a little over 8 foot long, and they're 2 inches thick. So this works out perfectly. As you can see, if you can get the track on straight, you can cut a straight line. And if you set the saw and the track up correctly, you will get a perfect 90-degree angle. All you have to do is match these on all the adjoining boards, and you're ready to join. Now I'm going to glue these up using biscuits to align the boards. But you can see as I drop this board one onto another, it sits there perfectly flat and straight. That's always a good sign, and I call it these boards are ready to join. I'll check very carefully for straightness. The boards themselves are pretty flat, not much cupping, hardly any twisting, and they go together very well. So I'll mark these for biscuits about every 8 inches because these boards are heavy. And once I get the glue on them and I drop one on top of the other, I want those biscuits to help me align these boards perfectly and quickly because they're not easy for me to move around. And I'll begin the clamping process. Now there were nails in here that I didn't discover until I discovered them with my saw blade. Nail, 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 nail. But these won't cause any real damage to the saw blade. Here's the tabletop all joined together, and you can see how rough this lumber is. It's gone through decades and decades of use, and its grain is lifting, they're splitting, there is some termite damage, but the edges are straight, the edges are glued up, and we have us a very interesting tabletop. The texture is beautiful, but it's just too much of a splinter hazard. So we're going to have to come up with some way to tame this beast and make it suitable for a tabletop. I'm going to try Shou Sugi Ban, also known as yakasugi, if I'm saying that right. This is a Japanese technique that's an ancient technique where you char the surface of the wood, and I'm going to use a roofer's torch. The concept is you char the wood, and I'm pretty sure sugi means cypress, while yaki means to heat with fire. And what this does is this burns the two types of wood that you find in the grain differently. The hardest part of the grain chars a lot less than the softest part. So the soft wood between the hard parts of the grain is charred deeper because it's softer and more porous. And after you burn the wood, you can scrape away the charred wood with a wire brush or something similar. And this will allow the hardest grain to remain while the soft wood in between is scraped away. And this gives you a very distinct relief, almost as if this wood were weathered in the ocean like a driftwood. Now you can see as I burn this, all the splintery and lifted parts of the wood are actually glowing and burning, and they're burning off. Anywhere that the flame can get in and between and around the wood and under the lifted areas, that wood burns away more easily. And over on the right-hand side, at about the center, You can see right there the moisture left behind in these channels that the termites have carved into the wood. I haven't seen any evidence of live termites, but I'm hoping this heat treatment will kill any that might still be alive. And here I am taking a wire brush just to test the char and see how well the charred wood will relieve the grain on this wood. Oh, that feels great. That's perfect. So I'm going to a more mechanized version, and I'm going to use a wire brush on a cordless drill. Now this is a lot of work. If you don't think it is, it will fatigue your wrist. But you have to work systematically, being aware of the grain. And this is actually my first time doing this, so I'm testing which directions, which handholds work best, how to accentuate the grain without diminishing it. And obviously you work with it as best you can, but this is a circular wheel. This is a brass wire brush, so it's not the hardest you can get. And a stiff nylon brush might do as well. I don't know. But what I used was brass wire, and it did an excellent job at removing the char. But you can see the air is filled with this charred ash. Now, as wood fiber and tiny particulate airborne matter is not good to inhale, I can't imagine that charred wood fiber is any better. So it's a great idea to use a face mask. And of course I did. But this is a very messy process. And if you were doing this with any kind of a cutting tool that made the fine, powdery dust, it would be everywhere. Now imagine it as a black, sooty dust everywhere. So set up to do this somewhere where you can afford to get dust on everything. But the texture is wonderful. This works particularly well for abused ancient wood like this, because what we're doing when we get this relief, and look how great a relief there is between the hard lines of grain and the soft lines of grain. So what we're doing is turning all the flaws of this wood into virtues. The flat sawn wood is actually the prettiest when we apply this technique, because we have the knot holes, we have the open grain, we have the cathedrals, even those holes that were drilled through the lumber for pipe become a virtue. You can see I've set up a fan to kind of keep the ash going in a general direction away from me. And I'm working systematically with this brush in more than one direction to remove the char. At first I'll go vertically up and down, and then lastly I'll come in and go along the grain. A couple of these boards are getting into the area of what we would call quarter sawn wood on one of their edges, where the grain is straight and tight and flat. And normally that would be choice lumber, something wonderful to use for building any project where you wanted straightness and integrity. But it's going to end up being the least interesting of the grains in this tabletop. It's really true that all the flaws become the virtues when we apply this technique. Now this took me about 2 of my 18-volt to accomplish, and an hour. It's a commitment, but it's not that tedious. And the reward is actually very proportionate to the amount of work that you'll put in. What's This was the California earthquake of July 4th, 6.4. The next morning, just after 8, we would have a 7.1. But this is life in California. You can actually have an earthquake and you're so used to the ground shaking that you just kind of take pause for a second, see how it's going to develop, and then get back to work. Working horizontally along the grain cleans out the softwood in between the hard grains in the same direction as the grain flows. And that gives you a more satisfying look. To accomplish that with a circular wheel, you hold the wheel at an angle so that the turning edge is following the direction of the grain. But as you look at this tabletop, and you can see all the streaks from the vertical or up and down strokes, you'll have to come back and go horizontally along the grain to help clear this up. But it depends on you, on the look that you're going for. I want this to have the deep relief, but I don't necessarily want it to look like it was burned systematically with a blowtorch. I want it to have a more natural, aged feel. So I'm going to work a little harder to clean out a lot of these apparent strokes with the wire wheel. And I'll come back with a flat wire wheel that I can actually run directly right with the grain and clean all this up even further. But right now, I'm going to enjoy a well-deserved and ice-cold beer. Now you can imagine yourself how many beers I actually did enjoy. I have this one here on camera, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. You can see on the work surface of this bench the soot and sawdust that is everywhere. This is a messy job. And I left the pipe clamps on as I burned it because I wasn't certain how the heat would affect the glue, if it would soften it. So I wanted to keep the table straight and tight while I applied the heat. And now, after I removed those clamps, you can see all the areas that I didn't get to with the wire brush. But look at that texture. Look at the deep relief in that grain. This is going to be a tactile sensation. When you sit at this table, you're just going to want to continually touch it. And here's my supervisor asleep on the job. Please, please don't bother me. I'm deep in concentration. All right, so I've enjoyed my cold beer, and it's time to get back to work. I'll clean up all these areas that were hidden behind the pipe clamps. And I'll work systematically to even out the look of the char remaining on this wood. I'll try to actually eliminate as much as I can. But the reveal of the grain that it provides is awesome. I'm working the edge here, and you can see, as I'm in the end grain, that it's a constant battle to control this drill against the motion of the wheel. Now this tabletop is heavy. Each one of these planks was about 27 pounds, and there's 6 of them. And I'm just one dude, so I use a lot more brain than brawn when I move this around because I only have one back to last me the rest of my life, and I still have a lot I want to do. So I'm going to remove one of these supports and then try to carefully leverage this up onto the tabletop where I can work on it as a flat surface. And it's like we've always been told, lift with your legs, not your back. So I bend my legs and I lift. And I'm using leverage to land this onto the tabletop and then put it into a position that is practical to work on. This edge closest to us now has yet to be charred at all because it was on the bottom. So I'll have to raise this tabletop up, and I'll do that by putting some of these 4x4s under it. And I'll set them deep towards the center of this tabletop so that they're not easily affected by the heat of the blowtorch. And then I'll char this edge and the remaining areas on the side that were covered by the 2x4s I used to give this stability while it was in a vertical position. Now these torches, this is a roofer's torch that I'm using, and it uses air induction to really magnify the intensity of the propane flame, and I was quite impressed with how quickly it handled the char for this wood. Again, I'm fighting the motion of the drill, but look at the grain relief that you get. This is outstanding. It's just beautiful. Nail holes, cracks, splits. They all char to different degrees depending on how much the flame can get in and around the specific area of wood. And this gives each one of these flaws its own unique beauty. Again, we're making virtues out of flaws. Now I have a flat wheel, and I'm going with the grain, right along in the grain, to try to even out the look of this wood relative to how much char we have removed. And I'm going to work on this for another hour or so. The beauty that you get from this treatment, again, it is directly proportionate to the amount of work that you're willing to put in. And it seems like the more attention to detail that you're willing to show, the greater the reward in beauty. Look at the depth of that relief. The green tint that you see here is from a green shade cloth that I have stretched overhead to protect me from the sun as I work outside. And these edges are nice and soft and rounded, and the fine fibers that would be splinter hazards are burned away. Look here, there's a nail still embedded in the wood. It's just below the surface, but coming through the grain that's been burned away. That's a flaw that we've turned into a virtue and a conversation piece. And I'm going to leave it there. There are some of these edges in the grain that will need extra work, and some lifted areas that may need glued down. But I'll take the time to do that so that this is a beautiful and practical table to enjoy. It's going to be an outdoor dining table with a conventional base, 4 legs, stretchers, and aprons. The focal point of this table will always be this top surface. Something your guests will enjoy every minute they sit before it. Now, my customer doesn't want a polyurethane or anything that looks plastic on this tabletop for a finish, and they have asked me to just use oil. And I'll use a mixture of beeswax, carnauba wax, maybe some mineral oil, or even orange oil. And that will bring out the grain and the natural color of this Douglas fir, which, although it looks green here because of the green tarp overhead, is actually pinkish. And I think we'll get a nice red hue to this wood that has only looked almost black for so many decades because of dirt. Look at that grain. It's holographic almost because of the relief. Now here you can see I've applied some Titebond 3 glue to some of the cracks and seams, and I'm going to let it soak in overnight. It dries dark, and as it dries, I think it will best match the dark grain of this wood. So it's the next day, and once again I'm going over the tabletop with this flat wheel in the direction of the grain to further refine the look and to remove any streaks of the char that remain because of incomplete removal, especially those that would show, especially any streaks that would highlight the vertical up and down movement as opposed to the horizontal linear grain of this wood. And I'm taking the opportunity to work on the more distinctive features and follow the grain in each one to try to bring it out even more, especially around these great knots. Also in the seams where there's glue buildup from the day before, I can use this wire brush to roughen that glue and remove it flush with the surface. Look at the distinctive beauty of this grain feature around this knot. There's a few of these in this tabletop, things that might be considered flaws that are now some of the more outstanding virtues of this piece. I've used the Titebond 3 also to fill some of the holes in the knots themselves. The customer didn't want to go with an epoxy filler, but I think that would be a great choice for a tabletop like this, especially if you dyed the epoxy a dark color to match the darkest features of the grain that remains. And I have to say, if it were my own tabletop, I might encapsulate it in a thick polyurethane satin finish that would give the ridges of this raised and lowered grain a nice round and encapsulated feel. This table is going to be used outdoors, but under a covered surface, so it won't have to deal a lot with UV damage. And I think a polyurethane would be a good choice. But oil is also beautiful in my opinion. I'm actually anxious to see how this will look, because it's already so beautiful. Well, here we have it. I'm rubbing in the oil, and the wood is turning a nice red, a burnt orange to a red. And it's beautiful. It just feels wonderful. I'm actually going to use a scrub brush to work this oil down into the grain because much of this grain is so deep. And this worked perfectly. It helped me push the oil completely over the tabletop, every surface, every nook and cranny. And this tabletop, which was about 43 inches by 8 foot and a few inches, took 48 ounces of my oil mixture. This old weathered wood was very thirsty. but it's beautiful. Just look at the depth of that relief. The brilliant color in these images under the sun. And the end grain is even beautiful. I can't stop touching it. I've really enjoyed this experience of learning Shou Sugi Ban. Every time I build something, I do learn something. And I hope you have too. Please consider subscribing.